first webinar. We're really pleased to be able to do this. We're also very pleased to put out a webinar that has such high demand. So that's really great. Maybe perhaps I can just give a very brief introduction to the purpose of the webinar, and then we can do a few housekeeping rules, and then let's just get straight into it. It's really important that we utilize the hour that we have as much as possible. So the purpose of this webinar is to share a little bit more information around the Education Cannot Wait funding mechanism, and this is specifically in the context of education in emergencies. And so we will be having 4 presentations today. The first presentation will give a very broad and I guess general context around the Education Emergencies framework, which has been developed by the Education Technical Learning Lab. Billy and Anne will just present to you the framework so that you have some familiarity of the framework before we then move on to Derek's presentation, which will give an overview of the Education Cannot Wait funding opportunity and funding stream. Sam will present from ADRA Somalia, will present to us a practice example of Education Cannot Wait funding in action. And then at the end of our final presentation will come from Derek, and he will share a little bit of feedback on the surveys that you had all completed. You may recall that we sent out some surveys to understand your education and emergency needs and to understand what it is you are currently doing with your offices, what are you implementing, and so Derek will share that data with you. So this is a structure. Maybe in terms of housekeeping, there's a lot of us on this call, which is absolutely great. Can we just ask for everybody to please keep themselves on mute? Please do use a chat function. We do have a lot to get through in the hour. We want to assign 10 minutes at the end of the session for us to be able to answer any questions. So as the presentation is going on, please feel free to use the chat. I will be moderating the chat, and we will ensure that we will get to the questions at the end of all of the 4 presentations. So again, thank you and welcome to the session. Let me hand over to Anne and Billy, and they are going to lead us in the first section, which is to give an overview of the Education in Emergency framework that has been developed by the Education Technical Learning Lab. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Anne, thanks.
Thank you so much, Milo. So I'm going to share my screen and start sharing our presentation. So I will give just an overview of Education in Emergencies if you're new to what this is, and then Billy is going to talk more specifically about the ADRA Education in Emergencies framework. So there we go. So the first thing is to just provide a background on education and emergencies and kind of how this all started. And so back in 2000, there were kind of 3 things that coalesced. And one of them was the Education for All, which was during the World Education Forum held in Dakar, Senegal. They created the Dakar Framework for Action, which outlined 6 goals that should be achieved by 2015. And there were 2 key statements in the Dakar framework. And one was that countries without the means will be financially supported. And secondly, that it specifically called for addressing the education systems affected by conflict, natural calamities, and instability. The second international initiative was the United Nations establishment of the Millennium Development Goals and the goal to achieve universal primary education by 2015. And lastly, during the World Education Forum, education ministers from conflict-affected states asked UN agencies for a process to strengthen cooperation between UN agencies, INGOs, and education and emergency contexts. And so they called for a global consultation on education and emergencies. And from this emerged the Education and Emergencies Network, called the Interagency Network for Education and Emergencies, or INEE, which is a membership network of practitioners, policymakers, researchers, and international leaders from around the world. Setting the foundation for education and emergencies are several key international conventions, declarations, and charters. Two of them are the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The second is the 1989 UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, in which in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, it states that every child is born with the right to survival, food and nutrition, health and shelter, and education, and to participation, equality, and protection. Other key international documents that support it are the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees, the Guiding Principles on Internal Displacement, the 2006 Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and the 2010 United Nations General Assembly Resolution on the Right to Education in Emergency Situations, among other international charters and declarations. So the provision of education was not initially considered part of the humanitarian response. Education was not initially included in the sphere communities humanitarian standards. Therefore, the Interagency Network for Education and Emergencies established the INEE minimum standards in 2004 through a consultative process with its members. There are 19 INEE standards across 5 domains. And in 2008, the minimum standards were adopted into the Sphere Humanitarian Charter. As focus and research over the decade increased, support of education and emergencies grew, in recognizing not only the human capital development aspects, but also the life-saving benefits. And research also began to show that the length of disruption from conflict, natural disasters, displacement is over 20 years, the entire education cycle for a child. In 2015, Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, established his Global Education First initiative. And in a statement introducing the initiative, the Secretary declared, "In almost all my visits to areas ravaged by war and disaster, the plea of survivors is the same: education first." In the United Nations My World 2015 survey, a global survey in which over 7 million people from over 194 countries participated, education was selected as the top development priority, higher than any other area. And in other surveys conducted during crises, parents and children have ranked education in the top 3 to 5 of their priorities, along with food, health, water, and sanitation. In 2015, the Sustainable Development Goals were established, and the importance of education and emergencies was recognized in Sustainable Development Goal number 4, which states inclusive and equitable quality education and lifelong learning opportunities for all, including children and other people in crisis-affected contexts. And proponents highlight that education is key to achieving all of the other goals. So as more information was gathered, short-term and long-term benefits of education became clear. The short-term benefits include providing life-saving information, such as how to avoid landmines, washing hands to avoid infection like cholera, or even during the pandemic for COVID-19, providing safe spaces to prevent children from being kidnapped, trafficked, or forced into child labor, preventing sexual assault, teen pregnancy, and early childhood marriage. Also providing psychosocial support for children and parents by reestablishing a routine and stability, and providing hope for the future. The longer term benefits, research has shown that each additional year of schooling increases an individual's potential income by as much as 10%. Economists estimate that each additional year of schooling increases annual GDP by 1%, and the earning potential is higher for girls, increasing up to 15%. Other longer-term benefits include participation in civil organizations and activities, as well as long-term health, and the ability for the government to reestablish public services such as education, increasing its legitimacy and addressing contentions in education can improve peace and provide increased stability. So the need for education during crises is clear, and then statistics in 2019 describe the scope of the issue. Keeping in mind that research has shown that the impact of conflicts, natural disasters, and displacement can be up to 20 years. So in 2019, there was an estimated 257 million out-of-school children globally. 127 million of the children were located in countries impacted by crisis. State-based conflicts were at a historic high in 2019. There were 54 state-based conflicts recorded, and that number is the highest since 1946. Natural disasters, which include floods, heat waves, hurricanes, earthquakes, wildfires, are on the rise. 2019 saw an increase of 53 events over a 9-year average of 343, impacting upwards of 94 million people. So climate change is impacting this and exacerbating the refugee crisis due to climate refugees. And for the pandemic, the UNICEF estimates that the pandemic sent 1.6 billion children home from school. Although some children were able to continue their education remotely, the UNICEF estimates that 463 million still do not have access to remote learning. And the longer students remain out of school, the less likely they will return. It's estimated that 24 million children will not return to school. The pandemic is reversing gains that have been made, especially in reducing child labor and teen pregnancy. And children and youth, especially in low resource contexts, have lost access to education and the economic factors that they need to survive. So many of you might be familiar with the humanitarian response of the phases of the crisis. So when education was included within the Interagency Standing Committee, so the UN Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs created this Interagency Standing Committee, and education was initially left out, but when it was included, it's being led by UNESCO and Save the Children. So the humanitarian response structure, it's also presents all of the different phases of the crisis. So you have the prevention, the mitigation, the preparedness, disaster response, recovery, and reconstruction, during which many of these phases overlap, and especially when there's long-term conflicts or protracted conflicts, these things will overlap. And lastly, there's a gap between the humanitarian response and development funding. Approaches to providing education during times of crisis can bridge this gap through intention and programming implementation. So this is just an overview of kind of the whole field and the whole scope of education and emergencies. And now I'm going to turn it over to Billy so that he can present ADRA's Education and Emergencies framework. You're on mute.
I've been on mute. I'm so sorry. And I'm trying to advance to the next slide. Okay. So what I was trying to say is, given all that we've learned, what is ADRA doing about it? I'm sure that some of you in different country offices, you are taking initiatives, you are addressing the issues, especially with the COVID response. I know different countries are actively participating, but as a whole, ADRA, we have developed a framework so that we can be unified in our approach. And the framework is still a work in progress, but the goal is for us to to combine all the best practices from international education standards and create a frame, basically a framework where every country office can adapt to their own situation. That way you don't have to reinvent the wheel. So the five goals that we have for the framework includes, first, to ensure that safe schools and learning environments are in place. And the second goal is to strengthen the quality education access in formal education. The third is to create education pathway for lifelong learning. And four, to enhance disaster risk reduction, DRR, and resilience. And five is to ensure accountability to meet our commitments. In a practical sense, what these goals are saying is that we have different methods to address education needs. So if a country is lacking in one aspect, now they can support in different aspect. If there's a country that has been experiencing flooding or some sort of natural disasters, you're asking yourself, what can I do? Well, you can start by doing an assessment, and if the greatest need is to ensure a safe environment for the children, to protect them from exploitations, to protect them from different abuses, and just to provide the stability, then maybe the best thing that you can do is to set up a safe place, or rehabilitate a school, in order to meet that demand. In some cases, that's not, it might be better to, if you're in a refugee setting or an IDP camp, that maybe repairing the schools is not, your best option, but you can train the teachers, you can provide resources, kits for education for the children. What's very interesting is that, when we think of disasters, when we submit, for those of you who have NIPS or proposals, we oftentimes forget that children are part of the population and they don't get served. And when we do, let's say, food delivery or even wash kit delivery, very often we don't even portion a part of that to children. So children are they are often forgotten when, we declare there is a disaster, that we're responding, and we don't accommodate their needs, because sometimes, and partly because of our training, is that we don't see children in the picture. And what education in emergency is saying is that we need to start thinking about children. We need to start thinking about the younger population, because they consist of a majority of the population. So by providing those framework, we're basically saying that, ADRA has a strategy to meet these demands. We have a strategy so that when we do respond to any disasters, that we do allocate some portion of it for education. And education can be seen as a platform for health education, for peace, for peace education, and for a range of different things. So basically, what the framework is producing is a baseline for you for the country offices, for ADRA as a whole, to have a unified strategy in order to address those needs. And to do that, we have a typical workflow, and that's adapting to what we currently have when there is a disaster. Is that, first of all, preparedness. We need to be prepared, that when there is a disaster, that we respond to them. But in our preparedness, we also need to prepare for how do we respond, how do we cater to children, and also how do we support the local population. And that's very important. It starts with updating your NIP, having people in mind, trainings, and coordinating with the local authorities, so that you can be pre-positioned in case something like that happens. And when there's an emergency that happens, you have the emergency response unit, which is based at ADRA International, who's responsible to coordinate all these emergencies, for you to contact, and also contacting local authorities. we also are aware that not all of you are experts on education, and those of you who are experts on education, tip my hats off to you. But you may have some questions about, okay, well, there is a disaster, there is a flooding in this area, how can we respond to education? So we have the education TLL, and we have some experts within the ADRA network who can support you in this aspect. Basically, if you are willing to do it, there is a way to do it. The next thing is assessment, going through the typical assessments, but also very important is to participate in the local clusters. There's often education cluster as part of the humanitarian cluster system that we need to participate in. And that's where the money is. By that, I mean, that's where funding typically takes place, or funders or donors and also partners, they coordinate with each other. So we have to be intentional about participating in those cluster systems. And after that, it's the response and the recovery phase, and very important to emphasize that, you know, we need to leave the population better than we found it, and also create resiliency for that. So in a nutshell, this is what ADRA, our goal is to do when we do, as we're addressing education and emergencies in our typical work in every level. I think that's it. So I'm gonna hand it over to Milimo.
Thanks, Billy. I did realize that I didn't do any introductions. I just kind of launched us straight in, so my apologies. My name is Milimo. I'm from the UK office. Anne gave us the context on education and emergencies, and Anne came in as an intern to the Education Technical Learning Lab, and she's done some great work in helping us to build an education emergency framework, which Billy from ADRA I has just presented. So thank you so much. For those that have just joined, please do put your questions in the chat box and we will get to them at the end. Going to hand over to Derek now, who is a co-chair of the Education Technical Learning Lab and is going to give an overview of the Education Cannot Wait opportunity. Thanks, Derek.
Thank you very much, Milimo, and thanks, Anne and Billy, for your presentation, giving an overview. Now we're going to go a little bit more in detail into one of the donors that is relatively new on the scene, but is becoming more and more influential in the sector for education emergencies, and also managing large amounts of funding. And that's Education Cannot Wait. I think many of you who are joining from offices in Europe and donor offices will know also that your governments are contributing quite a significant amount to this fund. Now in May, Education Cannot Wait started in May 2016 at the World Humanitarian Summit. There was a paper that was developed by ODI entitled Education Cannot Wait, which I think was where the phrase was coined. And during the World Humanitarian Summit of 2016, there was consensus to set up this platform and this fund for education in emergencies. And it also has influenced the Agenda for Humanity and become one of the initiatives under core responsibility for Leave No One Behind. And under the transformation agenda, ensure education for all in crisis. And as Anne mentioned before, it also links strongly to the SDG 4 on quality education for all. And overall, it was based on an analysis of the needs and recognition that there was significant underfunding for education, particularly in emergencies. In many cases, less than 2% of funding was going towards education. And so this fund was set up to respond to children's education needs in contexts affected by conflict, violence, disasters, and displacement. Here's a diagram that just describes what the current state of affairs is. Actually, in January 2021, last month, there was a meeting held in Geneva in setting up what is called the Geneva Global Hub for Education in Emergencies. And that was bringing together actors from different, you could say, types of organizations and institutions, and some of the ones that are already existing from earlier. Anne mentioned the INE network, International Network for Education Emergencies, formed in 2000. There was the ISC Global Education Cluster, which was formed in 2007. And then Education Cannot Wait in 2016. And then plus with the UN agencies, UNHCR, UNICEF, and UNESCO, ICRC, which also looks at, in particular, IDP and refugee situations. And then from the Swiss side, there was a Swiss Foreign Affairs University of Geneva and Graduate Institute in Geneva, who also form part of this group that decided it would be good to have a global hub for coordinating education emergencies. So the responsibilities I've highlighted in orange there, responsibilities are divided somewhat between the different groups. Global Education Cluster manages the coordination of education in emergencies overall. Education Cannot Wait is focusing more on the funding and resource mobilization for education emergencies. INE is focusing on the technical coordination. And then the Global Hub for Education Emergencies is intending to kind of bring all of that together into one kind of bigger platform. It's not clear yet how that platform will function. Whether it will be open for input from different member groups and so on, but at least through the representation that is there from at least Global Education Cluster, Education Cannot Wait, and INE are all membership groups and have advisory forums where NGOs and other groups can participate. And then also I just put off to the side there, Global Partnership for Education and World Bank also in bilateral discussions and coordination with Education Cannot Wait. Just this, I know this is very small and it's a lot of information, but I just wanted to present this slide to illustrate where the leadership for Education Cannot Wait is coming from, and the broad, you could say, engagement of particularly the donor countries in this process. The high-level steering committee, for example, here is made up of, or led by Gordon Brown as the special envoy, the Education Cannot Wait director, Yasmin Sharif, and then it has various government representatives, UK, Norway, USAID, Canada, Denmark, Netherlands, etc., European Commission, Sweden, Germany, Switzerland, and then some of the UN agencies also participating in that. And then at the moment, it has 2 NGO or INGO representatives, Save the Children and Plan, although currently that's in the process of election. So we'll see for the next period of, I think, 2 years, who will represent the NGO setup in this forum. Here you can see also an illustration of the funding that has come into Education Cannot Wait, and maybe just to reiterate the importance or the growing importance of this of Education Cannot Wait in education emergencies. In total, they've received since 2017 $570 million from 22 donors, and they have disbursed up until 2020 $337 million to 175 grantees. Of those grantees, 36% are NGO, 61% are UN, and 3% others. So you can see that it's still fairly dominated by the UN, but they are trying to make sure that this fund is accessible to those who are operational on the ground. I won't dwell on this slide much, but you can see Education Cannot Wait has quite an elaborate organizational structure headed by Yasmin Sharif. but also has a governance and finance and operations team, and an executive office. It has a strategic planning and accountability team, M&E and reporting team, education team, communications and advocacy team, partnership and donor relations team, etc. So it's fairly well established. Just maybe a side note is that our global advocacy campaign for ADRA, Every Child Everywhere in School, is in communication with the communications and advocacy team. Okay, this is just an overall, you could say, strategic framework for Education Cannot Wait. Again, I won't go in detail here, but you can see that they focusing largely on political action and mobilization of funding, building local systems, as well as global and regional systems. And ultimately, the outcomes that they want to achieve for the beneficiaries are equity, continuity of education, access to education, quality, and then protection. Here's a map. This is also available online on the UNICEF portal. They have a transparency portal where they report the disbursements and incomes for Education Cannot Wait. Here you can see more or less the coverage of where Education Cannot Wait funding is going to. It doesn't go everywhere in the world, but it's focused largely on sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, Middle East, and then also with the Venezuela crisis increasingly in South America, and then a little bit in Central Asia too. Here's another on the disbursements for 2019. The darker color is the multi-year resilience program, and the other investments is mostly COVID-19 as well as first emergency response window funding. There you can see also some money that was used, that was actually before COVID, sorry, but in 2019 also some funding for Indonesia and Papua New Guinea. This is something that also may be of interest for some of you. This is the plan for the development of the multi-year resilience program. And here we see countries that have already received support for the multi-year resilience program. We also see some of the, we also see some of the countries that are still on the radar for this coming year. And it's important to note also that they go for a 2 to 3 year cycle. So, for example, in 2018-19, we can see countries like Bangladesh, Uganda, Afghanistan, Somalia, etc. So those ones are, and South Sudan, those ones are currently being implemented, but maybe 2022, 2023, those ones will come up again for another cycle of funding. For this year, we're expecting that there'll be funding for Iraq, Cameroon, Libya, Lebanon, Sudan, Haiti, Pakistan, and Burundi. And so we have already started some discussion with some of those offices as to how we can maybe assist in positioning for that type of funding. We have been in discussion a little bit with the regional office regarding Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, who received allocations in 2020, but there may be possibilities through subcontracting for ADRA to still access some of that funding. But as you'll see later on, it's important for us to be a part of the process very early on for us to be able to access funding from Education Cannot Wait. Coordination of the funding. First of all, Education Cannot Wait's entry point is Education in Emergencies Coordination Mechanisms, with the first phase coordinated by the cluster or Education in Emergency Working Group. There are also a number of interventions supported by Education Cannot Wait for refugees, and those are often coordinated through the Refugee Education Working Group. And so when wanting to look at funding from Education Can Wait, it's very important, and I think Sam will emphasize that more in his presentation. It's important to engage in these in-country coordination mechanisms. And it's important also not only to engage with the coordination groups for education, but also with the other UN stakeholders in country and the donor community. Because many of them have a vested interest also in Education Cannot Wait. And then when it comes to the submission of a proposal, usually there's one cohesive proposal that is put together for the country. So whether it's ADRA, Save the Children, Plan, etc., Norwegian Refugee Council, all of those proposals are reviewed and so on, and then it's put together into one proposal for the country, which then is submitted. This is just, sorry, I didn't realize it had the, so this is just a quick overview of the application process. You can see that there's an application form, results framework and budget, and then once that's submitted, it's detailed feedback that's provided from Education Cannot Wait, and then ultimately a full application is put together. And this often then becomes one application for the crisis or one application for the country. Okay, and this is just a quick overview of the types of initiatives that Education Cannot Wait support, and it's not limited to this. They support communication campaigns, distance education, school feeding, teaching and learning supplies, psychosocial support, protecting and training teachers, support to caregivers, and water and sanitation. But also, I think Sam may also talk a bit more about this when it comes to his presentation. The grantee selection, the core principle is that organizations who are deciding on the grantees themselves cannot themselves be considered as a grantee because of conflict of interest. So usually there's a panel that's set up in the country to review proposals. And so an organization that is part of the review process usually wouldn't be a recipient. Some exceptions, I think, have been made, but then it requires no objections to be given by the working group members, for example, for UNICEF. Here, so the question is then, how do we engage as ADRA in this process? And here you can see at the ADRA implementing level, it's important to engage in the National Education Cluster Advisory or the Education Emergencies Working Group or the Refugee Working Group. It's important to interact with UNICEF, OCHA, also interact with subnational coordination, as well as UNHCR. There's also, for Education Cannot Wait, they have an implementers group, which ADRA Somalia has recently joined. And then at the donor representative, ADRA donor office representative level, ADRA Norway and ADRA International have membership in the Education Cannot Wait INGO advisory group as of recently, this last year. There's also at country level, most countries have a coordination group for Global Campaign for Education, which also is linked to Global Partnership for Education. And then with the Education Technical Learning Lab, there's the Global Education Cluster Advisory and the INE network. And I've just put for reference, we'll share this later, but if you have any more questions or follow-up or support that's needed, you could contact any of these persons. So I'll end there so that we can pass back over to Milima.
Thanks, Derek. That's great. A good kind of detail run of ACWs. So thanks so much. Let's just go straight over to Sam, who is the chair of the Education Technical Learning Lab, and he's going to talk us through a practical example of this being applied in Somalia. Thanks, Sam.
Thank you, Milimo. Thank you, Derek, for that broad overview of the program. I want to share our experience as ADRA Somalia. How are we able to access the ECW grant when it was first released in 2017, and where are we with the program, and what are some of the pointers, or what can help us as other country offices to try and access the fund. To begin with, in Somalia, the first emergency response was launched in 2017. That's the first time when ECW implemented the program in Somalia. ADRA Somalia was one of 7 implementing agencies to the first emergency response. It was very competitive. It attracted over 33 applicants. But we were one of the 7, and the total budget during the first emergency response was $565,000, implemented over a 1-year period. And then after the first emergency response was over, there was a second call, a much bigger call for a multi-year resilience program, which was funded in 2019. So from the first emergency response, how ECW looked at it, they wanted a more longer term programming. Instead of the standard standalone projects on emergency, they wanted to link it more to long-term development. So looking at the resilience side of education and linking it to more continued development education, looking at the humanitarian and development nexus. So again, as ADRA Somalia, we applied for the program. And the total budget is just over $8 million from 2019 to 2022. And then last year, 2020, during the COVID-19 pandemic, there was another call as well to provide support to schools, because schools had been closed. In Somalia, schools were closed for a period of 8 months, from March to August. So just having activities around ensuring, although schools are closed, education can still continue. So looking at distance education, and when schools were opened, looking at ensuring a safe return to school for learners. So that was implemented and completed in December of last year. So in our context, what does ECW look at, or what were they looking at, and what did we respond to in our proposal? Number one, ECW wanted to see an intentional increase in national commitment to education in emergencies. Mostly, and most of the time, you'll find there's a lot of support going to more long-term education at the expense of education in emergencies, which is equally important because it provides that link between the children who are out of school or children in crisis contexts joining education and then joining long-term education. So looking at that bridge. So they wanted to see an increased national commitment to education in emergencies. Similarly, they wanted to see deliberate efforts and strategies to increase funding to education in emergencies. Again, there's a lot of support that's done or that is given to more development programs at the expense of education in emergencies. Similarly, they wanted us to plan a lot jointly with other ongoing mechanisms. This can be through the existing clusters, or ensuring this timely response in the event of emergencies, that this was done on time. So they didn't want us to do it alone. We needed to coordinate with other existing mechanisms at country level. They wanted us to show deliberate activities targeting capacity strengthening for EIE at government level, in our case at the Ministry of Education, looking at the programming side and the monitoring and evaluation and learning sides. So again, they wanted to see evidence of that. And very importantly, they expected us to show programs which can, number one, ensure equity, continuity, Derek spoke about that, and very important, quality, and then ensuring that the environments where the learners are coming to are actually protected, that the learner feels safe in the school environment. So that's what they wanted to see in terms of systemic outcomes. Looking at the framework broadly, we were guided by 3 pillars. Number one, accountability, partnership, and very importantly, linking EIE to more development orientation. Of course, the humanitarian principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence came into play. They expected us to work a lot with the federal and state leadership. In the Somalia context, it's a federal system. So you have the federal government, and then you have the state level ministries. So they expected a lot of partnership, or at least consulting with both levels. And then they expected us again to show a lot of coordination with learners, who are of course the main target of the program, with parents as well, and with local institutions and communities, because to them and to us, all of them are assets, and they are equal partners in the search for sustainable solutions to all the education challenges. Of course, they wanted us to show how we will reduce the vulnerability of most marginalized groups, especially during COVID-19. And then again, show a lot of work around safe and learner-friendly approaches at school level. And then very importantly, synergizing with other ongoing interventions. So not implementing in a vacuum, but showing how we are going to link the program to other more longer term interventions. They wanted us to deliberately target at-risk groups. In the case of Somalia, we have a very big constituency who are internally displaced. We have refugees as well. And also they wanted us to deliberately have actions targeting girls. The program is actually targeting 50% girls. In terms of methodology, briefly, I mentioned about working within existing sector coordination mechanisms. In our case, we work a lot with the education cluster, working a lot with the mechanisms which exist at school level. In our context, it's called community education committees. So working a lot with them and making sure that they own the program. We needed to innovate. So we needed to show a lot of innovation and best practices. What can we replicate? What is in our context which we can use to replicate in other programs? And of course, building on the lessons learned. I spoke about the two-tier engagement at federal level and at state level. And very importantly, they wanted us to inculcate sustainability in the program. So in summary, what should we look at when planning to apply for ECW funding? Number one, very importantly, we need to participate in the sector coordination. In our case, we are very active in the education cluster. In some instances, we do lead the cluster in certain regions of Somalia. So that also helps increase our visibility, and it played a key role in making sure that we were able to get the grant. Very importantly, ECW calls for a lot of joint assessment and reviews. So again, working within what is being coordinated in terms of assessment, not doing your own individual assessment, but actually doing it within existing mechanisms. We work a lot with other agencies, UNICEF in particular, Save the Children, who are very big in education, NRC, Norwegian Refugee Council, and many others. Just we coordinate our work a lot with those existing mechanisms. It's very important that as an agency, you are accepted by the local authorities, the Ministry of Education in our case in particular, and very importantly as well, you need to align to the sector priorities. In our case, our program had to align to the education sector strategic plan. So it's very important that when you're planning a program, align it within existing sector priorities. It's very important to continually share information with the education cluster. In our case, we normally share information and reports at least every month. We report what we are doing. And then we have a matrix where we normally share the kind of activities we are doing. Number one, to just avoid overlaps with other partners, to just show synergies and to ensure complementarity with other grants. It's very important that you show clear linkage with long-term development grants. In our case, we partner a lot with the Global Partnership for Education. We are actually implementing the Global Partnership for Education, the European Union grant, which is implemented by ADRA Somalia through ADRA Germany. We partner a lot with the USAID grant and with the NORAD grant as well. So just showing that linkage, because the program is supposed to be linking resilience to long-term education programming. Again, very importantly, we are supposed to report, or at least you need to constantly report on the financial tracking system by UNOCHA. It's an online system, very easy to fill, where you normally provide information on your grant. How much have you received? How have you spent it? Just for transparency. So it's very important that you show that, and UNOCHA uses that to track funding, not necessarily in the education sector, but in the 7 different clusters of the UN cluster system. It's very important for any ADRA office intending to go for the funding to have a good working relationship with other major education actors. In our case, we work a lot, as I indicated earlier, with UNICEF, with Save the Children. So it's important to have that working relationship. We cannot implement in a vacuum. We will have to create partnerships with these other actors. And then importantly as well, you should have a willingness to bring a match, especially during the assessment and the proposal development cycles, because there's normally a cost when it comes to developing the proposal, because you develop with a consortium, and also during the assessment. So there is a cost, not as big, but you have to show that willingness to bring in a match. So this is what we learned, and this is what I think we should ensure we are following. Should we want to target the ECW funding? Yes, so thank you. Back to you, Milimo.
Thanks, Sam. That was really informative and it was a really good insight. So thanks so much for sharing that with us. So we've only got one more presentation left, and that is just to kind of give an overview of the Education Emergency Survey that we sent out, just so that you can know what the results are and where other country offices and colleagues are working in a network. We've had a few questions in the chat. Most have already been answered. Please do continue to put your questions in the chat, or if you prefer to raise your hand and ask them, we can do that at the end. I think I'll let Derek do that. We'll probably need an extra 5 minutes since we started about 5 minutes late to accommodate that process. But so far, not seeing many questions. So we must be doing a really good job and being super thorough. Maybe that's what it is. So Derek, I think let's go ahead and let's see if more questions come in from our participants.
Okay, thanks. I'll just get this back up again. Okay, actually a little bit. Apologies for that. My computer is going a little bit slowly right now, so just give me a second to get back to the correct place on the presentation. Good. So many of you have received the survey already towards the end of last year, and we sent it out to the whole network, but we didn't get responses from everybody. You can see there the map of the responding countries. You can see mostly represented from Europe, Asia, or at least Central Asia, some Southeast Asia, and mostly Africa. Here you can see we did a little bit of scoring analysis to see how many of the different factors of preparedness for education emergencies funding were being achieved by the different offices. And of the respondents, you can see those who look like they could be a little bit stronger at this stage. South Sudan, Myanmar, Ethiopia, Syria, Zimbabwe, Cameroon were the top scorers. But the purpose of the survey wasn't really to assess the capacity of the offices as much as to see where we are as a network and what we maybe need to focus on in order to strengthen our preparedness. It was also interesting to see the diversity of donors that were or funding that was being accessed from different donors. And most of the funding for education activities that was reported was from ADRA network sources. And I think that has a lot to do with the emergency management unit and the emphasis that they put on education during the COVID responses and also in recent emergency responses. There's also quite a lot of support for education through EU ECHO support, and that I think is also a reflection of the emphasis that has been made at the European level. And then, of course, UNICEF, NORAD, DANIDA, and some German and UK funding also. So a lot of the donors are also starting to pick this up more as a mainstream activity for humanitarian funding. We also, just to mention, as ADRA Technical Learning Lab, we're trying to strengthen the participation within the lab. So it was good to hear that quite a number of officers are interested in engaging with Education Technical Learning Lab. And so we'll follow up with that also for applications. Obviously, we can't have 50 people in the Education Technical Learning Lab, but we are interested in getting officers who have experience and expertise in education into the group so that we can increase the learning that is there. Education activities that were reported from officers, you can see the highest percentage was in primary education, basic education, with 74% of the responding officers indicating they have programming in that area, and then vocational skills training. Actually, we were expecting that there would be more who were doing wash-in schools, etc. But yeah, in general, there's quite a good spread and quite a lot of capacity within the network.
Sorry, Derek, I think
yes.
Your presentation is not showing very clearly. We see the presenter's view and we don't see the full slides.
I think, apologies. Is it showing now or not?
Yeah, we can see, yeah, we still see the presenter's view, but we can see the full slides now. So I think that's fine. Thank you.
Let me just, maybe let me try to do it again. I've had this problem once before. Let me try and share it once more. The next slide that I had actually on was, can you see it now?
Yeah, we don't see the full screen, but we can see the slides. So I think you can go ahead with that. Okay, yeah,
that's fine. The next one was education cluster coverage. I thought it would be useful to put this one up because you know, we talk a lot about how important it is to engage with the education cluster, but it's also important to recognize that the education cluster isn't present in every country. There are certain priority countries where they set up the UN coordination. Some of it has to do also with the government's acceptance of the UN coordination system within the country. So even countries, for example, like India, the other coordination mechanisms which are set up mainly by NGOs, not directly the UN. But that being said, it is important to engage in the education coordination, but we found that this was an area of weakness overall. Only 18% of ADRA officers were members of the Inclusion Net or Protection Network. Some 31% were members of the Education or Education Emergencies cluster. And yeah, only 10% were playing an active role in leadership in these clusters. And then with regard to emergency coordination itself, we see that there was also 65% of officers that weren't really engaged in the broader humanitarian coordination. So this is in conclusion. Overall, it looks a bit crazy, that graph or that diagram, but for each of the regions, we mapped out the different areas or competencies. And the areas which showed the most weakness was around the humanitarian coordination engagement, education cluster engagement, as well as staff capacity. And so in order to better position ourselves for education emergencies and ECW funding, we need to focus on probably these aspects of our work. Yeah, thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Derek.
Apologies for the technical glitches there.
So don't worry, we'll post the presentations as well, so everyone will have access. Let's go straight into the questions because we're a little bit over time. First question is for you, Derek, which is from Sophia. You had mentioned in your first presentation the list of countries that would be targeted by ECW, and that you've already started that engagement with some of the ADRA offices. Should like to know whether Syria is included.
Yes, thanks. And Sam may want to comment on this too, but the list that I gave was for the multi-year resilience program. And so ECW have, you could say, two main streams of funding. One is the first emergency response, which is designed for rapid responses to crisis situations. And then there's the multi-year resilience program, which is more on a strategic level planning. Syria was, I think in 2019, received the last round of funding, and actually is well positioned and has been well positioned for ECW funding for some time. For the multi-year resilience programming, we expect that will come up again maybe in 2022. But I think it's important, even if your office isn't listed on the multi-year resilience programming, that you continue to engage, because I think, Sam, there are a lot of other funding possibilities that come outside of the multi-year resilience program, isn't that right? So, I mean, for example, in Ethiopia recently, there's been funding that's been released for the Tigray crisis, both on the Sudan side as well as on the Ethiopian side. And so, you know, if we follow, whenever there's a large crisis that's taking place, it's likely that ECW will also have some funding allocated. And in Sudan, for the Tigray crisis, for the refugees coming from Ethiopia into Sudan, they allocated $2 million, for example. So it's quite a large amount of money if you compare to what, for example, even ECHO or others often will release for a crisis. So it is definitely worth pursuing. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Sam, did you want to add to Derek's response?
No, Derek captured it very well. Apart from the FER and the multi-year resilience program, there's always funding coming up depending on the crisis. In addition to the Tigray crisis, there was the support to responding to the COVID pandemic. So thank you.
Okay, great, perfect. Next question from Annalyn. Can implementing countries submit a proposal to the ECW funding, or do they have to work with an ADRA supporting donor office?
You want to answer that one, Sam?
Yes, that's fine. There are definite advantages of applying with the ADRA donor office. Number one, when it comes to matching, maybe during the assessment, or when you're doing the actual proposal development. So there are advantages. Of course, you can also apply directly as a country office. But yes, I think both mechanisms can work. In our case, we applied directly.
Great, thank you. Louis' question: if a country office is interested to get into the education sector, what advice, support would you give?
All right, Derek, you want to go?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think it's good to reach out to, to one of the supporting officers who are working extensively in the education sector, or have a priority for that. That could be ADRA UK, it could be ADRA Norway, ADRA International. Billy, you also mentioned in your presentation that anybody who would like to get into the education sector, particularly in emergency response, is quite welcome to contact the ETLL, or to contact also ADRA International, EMU. And we have a number of technical specialists, both at the country level as well as at ADRA International and within the supporting offices, who would be more than happy, I think, to support and assist. But I think it's also, apart from support that's available from supporting offices and international networks, I think it's also important to start engaging at the local level by attending education cluster and getting involved with UNICEF and other actors on the ground. Thanks.
Okay, great. John, you asked a very similar question to Annalyn, which I think Sam has already answered, which is what is the preference to apply as a consortium or as to go alone? If you have a further question to that, let me know and I'll ask that one. Sharon has asked, and we receive questions on this all the time, are you planning to have an ADRA education community of practice? Sam?
Yes, we have been trying to create an ADRA community of practice with mixed results, but definitely it's one of our things to do in the Education Technical Learning Lab, because we realize there's a lot of resources out there with respective country offices. So it's something we have been planning to roll out. It hasn't moved as fast as we would like, but it is something that we are definitely looking at, and you'll be hearing from us on that pretty soon. Also, we are always accepting members to the Education Technical Learning Lab on a rolling basis. So if you will be interested to be a member of the Learning Lab, feel free to reach out to either myself or to Derek, or to the contacts that were provided by Derek. Thank you.
Okay, and the last question that I see in the chat is from Henry. Are there only selected countries for ECW, or can any country office apply? I think that's for you, Derek.
I think the map that I showed a little bit earlier, and you'll have that available in the PowerPoints that we'll share, or that will be available on ENET. ECW do have focus countries. In general, it's the countries of sub-Saharan Africa, countries that are facing refugee crises in South America, as well as some Central Asian and South Asia, Southeast Asian countries. So it would be important with regard to ECW to look at that, and probably to talk to your education cluster and see. I know when I was working in Myanmar, we were engaged with the education cluster, and there was a lot of preparatory work that was being done kind of to lobby for Education Cannot Wait funding to be made available to Myanmar. And so I think, and then the second thing is that Education Cannot Wait isn't the only donor that funds education. If you look at the SURF funding or the UN pooled funding, very often they're making a certain percentage of funding for education. I don't know across all countries, but very often it's like 20 or 30% of the funding is earmarked for education responses. And so if you're applying to different pooled funding within your country, very often you can get funding for education in emergencies. With ECHO, there's also in the HIPs more and more funding that's earmarked for education. Yeah, and I don't know if anybody else from the ETLO wants to also comment. Billy, maybe?
Yeah, I can add. So we also have private funding. The private fundings from, especially when there's a disaster, I think we also need to keep that in mind. So when we, let's say if there is a disaster in your country, that it's not the private funding that we have. Typically, it's $15,000 of emergency funds, so that the emergency response can get started. That 15,000 portion of it will be coming from ADRA International. Portion of it will be coming from the regional and also local division, but that funding is not allocated to specific sectors. It's allocated to all sectors, but unfortunately, people are not taking advantage of the education sector. There's a lot of focus on food, wash, shelter, and not a lot of people are taking. So basically, we have these seed money that can be allocated for education. So I encourage you to, when you do submit, if there is a disaster or you are funding a project, remember that we do have some private funds that can be used for education emergencies.
Great. Thank you very much. I think we've come to the end of our questions. I'm not seeing any other hands raised from those that weren't able to engage in the chat. So thank you very much for your questions. Also, thank you so much for the positive comments. It seems that the The presentation has been very useful and very relevant. So we appreciate that feedback. Just a few things to say. I think Billy gave a really good landing point, which is our role in the Education and Technical Learning Lab is to support you to increase your education engagement in country. So we hope that this presentation will increase that engagement, and we are here to support in any way that we can. Please do keep track of us on ENET, and does a really good job in trying to keep our ENET section updated for any new information that we will be releasing. Derek has already posted the information already in the group for all of our contact details for all of us that are in the Educational Technical Learning Lab if you want to reach out to us, but it's also on ENET as well. I'm just seeing a few more questions. Thomas, do you see, okay, can I squeeze this in? I hope it's okay. I know we're a bit over time. Do you see the digitalization as an important part of the education in emergencies? Yes, let's make that the last question. Derek?
Yeah, it's coming up a lot for us here in Norway also, and we're increasingly using the tablets and so on as a learning device. We've been piloting that in Mali and Niger, and I think going forwards we also may roll that out further. Just using tablets in the classroom to help children to interact with both technology as well as using it as a learning tool, I think is growing in interest. But there's also, I don't know, Sam, there's the use of radio and other, with distance learning, MP3 players, etc. So I think there is a growing, particularly in the COVID-19 situation, a growing use of technology.
Great, thank you. And last point to say, please do share any challenges, obstacles, or issues that you have regarding the openness and transparency with the education coordination in country or ECW funding, so that it can be shared with the ECW high level steering group. Okay, thank you all for joining and for participating, and you will hear from us soon. And please do get in touch. And as Sam rightly said, we are wanting to expand our membership group, so we are taking applications. Okay, thanks everybody for joining. Thanks and take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.